Welcome everyone. Here's the afternoon. In Israel, it's the evening. So we're very pleased to have Rabbi Fischer lead a session about the Hatam Sofer. And I'm sure he'll tell us a lot about his place in history and his work. Rabbi Fischer is an independent writer, a translator, rabbi. He holds degrees from Yeshiva University, and he's working towards a doctorate at Tel Aviv University. He has a smicha from the chief rabbinate in Israel. He's worked as a writer. He's involved with Rabbi Elli Fischer's Pinei Halakhah. He's a co-founder of MAPA. That's a project that applies quantitative analysis to rabbinic literature. He's a founding editor of the Lair House, a web magazine of contemporary Jewish thought. And he's written many articles in various places, various sites. He has a particular interest in religion and politics in Israel, interplay between legal and non-legal elements of the Talmud, and Central European Jewish history. And we look forward now to Rabbi Fischer's teaching about the Hatam Sofer and his work. Thank you, Rabbi Fischer, and welcome.
Thank you. So did you hear this one? How many Orthodox Jews does it take to change a light bulb? Change? We don't change. So that idea, that mythos of that's what it means to be Orthodox. It means rigidly unchanging. That's an idea that is ascribed to the Hatam Sofer, or it's associated with the Hatam Sofer more than with any other figure in modern Jewish history. And for starters, I'd like to take a look at how Hatam Sofer is described in a few recent and very, very good works of contemporary scholarship, contemporary Jewish scholarship. And these are examples. This is not an exhaustive list. This is how Hatam Sofer is described. So this first one is from a book that came out a couple of years ago called Jewish Legal Writings, edited by Liora Betnitsky and Yonatan Brafman, another Dallas name for those who have been listening. I actually helped them work on, I worked on this book with them. I translated a number of the sources that they used, including some of the responsa from Hatam Sofer. So they have an introductory paragraph on Hatam Sofer, and this is how they describe him. So the biographical details, we'll get into that a little bit more in a little while. But if you see how he's described, his approach to Jewish law, we're in the sixth line or so, his approach to Jewish law is characterized by strict conservatism, expressed in a statement that would become the motto of his followers: the new is forbidden by the Torah, chadash asur min haTorah. Sofer asserts what he claims is the authority of an unchanged tradition, which he simultaneously constructs, meaning obviously the tradition wasn't unchanged, or it was constantly changing, but he asserted that it's unchanging. Indeed, Sofer's motto itself is based on an innovative reinterpretation of a classical rabbinic dictum, right? Chadash asur min haTorah shows up in the Gemara meaning something else. It's talking about chadash as in new grain that was from the new crop that couldn't be eaten until after Pesach. So Sofer's innovative conservatism is evident in his leveling of previously acknowledged legal distinctions, meaning he blurs the distinctions between black letter law and custom, and between rabbinic law and biblical law. Why? To solidify Jewish law as a monolithic structure that must be accepted in its entirety. He argues that rabbinically instituted laws possess biblical authority, and contemporary rabbinic courts cannot modify them. Another example, this is from, I think the second printing of the book was in 1995, The Jew in the Modern World, a documentary history by Paul Mendes-Flohr and Judah Reinhartz. Leading figure in the struggle of traditional rabbis against reform was the highly esteemed Talmudic scholar Moses Sofer, known as Hatam Sofer. Opposition to reform was soon extended to all attempts to integrate Jews and Judaism into the modern world. To preserve the integrity of their ancient faith, Jews were urged to maintain not only the Halakhah, but a distinctive, even segregative style of life. He spoke of Shalem, standing for shame, Lashon Malbush, right? Name, language, and dress. And he presented these most forcefully in his widely read Ethical Testament. And I'll offer as an anecdote. So I have a son who's currently studying for what's called the Bagrut, a matriculation exam in Israeli high schools. He's in 11th grade. He just took his history Bagrut yesterday. So over Shabbat, we were studying some things and we were going over, his notes. And I saw there's always a question about responses to enlightenment and reform, a question relating to what are the different types of responses and, what are the differences between neo-orthodoxy and orthodoxy. And you see from from the way that they ask the questions that they're just looking for you to spit back Hatam Sofer, Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, Rabbi Shamshon Rafi Hirsch, Torah in Derech Eretz, meaning these are the bullet points, the bumper sticker version of it. That's what you get. You get Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. So in this view, which is still the prevailing view, based on the work of Jacob Katz and Moshe Samet, the orthodoxy that was developed, invented by Hatam Sofer, segregationist, rigid, unchanging, ultra-conservative, strict, elevates prohibitions, doesn't distinguish between different gradations, whether something is a mere custom and something is black letter biblical law. That's the prevailing approach. What I'd like to do today is look directly at the sources and see if we can't complicate that view a little bit or a lot bit. First, some biographical information. So we saw here, he was born in 1762, died in 1839. So his life really straddled the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. The turn of the century was about the midpoint of his life. He was born in Frankfurt. In fact, almost all of his responsa, he signs off Moshe Hakatan Moshe Sofer mi Papdam, right? The insignificant, the minor Moshe Sofer in Papdam, the Jewish acronym for Frankfurt am Main. That's where he was from, and he was from a pedigreed rabbinic family in Frankfurt. His great grandfather was the Maharsha Shach, right? One of the leading rabbis of Frankfurt and of Central Europe in his day. And his rabbeim were Rabbi Pinchas Horowitz, the Baal Haflah, the author of Haflah, and Rabbi Natan Adler, who was a Kabbalist and also a brilliant and creative figure, and also a very controversial figure in his day. He actually left Frankfurt when he was a teenager, when he was 16 years old. He left Frankfurt because his controversial rabbi, Natan Adler, was banished from the city and was wandering around in Central Europe. So he went with him to Bohemia and Moravia, and eventually Natan Adler moved back to Frankfurt, but Hatam Sofer, for the rest of his life, he never went back to Frankfurt. So from the time he was a teenager, he was in Central Europe, in the Habsburg realms. His first rabbinic position was in the city of Dresnitz, which is today in the Czech Republic, in the Bohemian part of the Czech Republic. That's southeastern Czech Republic. His second one, which was he was there for about 6 years. The second one, he was there for about a decade. That was in the city of Mattersdorf, or what's today in Austria is known as Mattersburg. Then it was part of the Hungarian crown lands, and it was part of a it's a part of a group. Mattersdorf is a group of about 7 communities, maybe a little bit more, but they were known as the 7 communities, the Sheva Kehilot, or the Sieben Gemeinden, that are in the part of Austria called Burgenland on the Austrian-Hungarian border today. So it's Deutschkreuz and Lachenbach and Eisenstadt and Mattersdorf. I like to call that region the 7 Dorfs, but that's me. And I work that joke in at every possible occasion.
Iberland.
So this is Iberland. We're not even, this lecture, we're not even going to touch Unterland. Some of Hatam Sofer's students, just to clarify what Rabbi Silber is saying, Oberland and Unterland are 2 regions of historical Hungary, meaning we're not talking about today's Hungary. Today's Hungary is about 1/3 of territory that was included in pre-World War I Hungary, before the Treaty of Trianon, which ended World War I. Oberland is the northwestern part of Hungary, the area basically from Budapest and north and west, right? So it includes the Burgenland, it includes much of what's today Western Slovakia, and northwest Hungary proper. And Unterland is, it was considered a backwater. It was much more religiously conservative. It was much more Hasidic. And you're talking about regions like Transylvania, of Marmarosh, if these names mean anything to you, or of the Subcarpathian Ruthenia, Munkac and Chust and Ungvar, cities like that, and far eastern Slovakia, like cities like Michalovce. And even though they were both part of Hungary, these were very distinct cultural territories. Oberland was much more affected by German culture. They were less, they tended to speak German, not Yiddish. They tended to, the Jews that lived there tended to migrate from Bohemia and Moravia southward during there was a time that there were laws passed in Moravia and Bohemia that only 1 Jew per family could inherit the right to live there. It was called the Familien's Law. So a lot of the Jews from Oberland moved south into Hungary from Bohemia and Moravia, whereas in the eastern parts, in Unterland, the Jews that were there moved there generally from Galicia, from the part of Poland that was annexed by Austria in the partitions of Poland in the late 1700s. So so you had some real cultural differences, and we are going to see a little bit how Hungary was a little bit of a melting pot between the more German-inflected forms of Jewishness and the more Polish-inflected forms of Jewishness, and this came to a head in various customs, especially customs concerning facial hair, beard growing, and shaving. So those were very, very much part of his landscape. In 1806, he got the job as the chief rabbi of the city of, was then known as Pressburg. Today it is Bratislava, the capital city of Slovakia. It was one of the largest Jewish communities in Hungary. It was between it and Budapest didn't exist yet. Budapest was, as many people know, Budapest was 2 cities. It was Buda and Pest on opposite sides of the Danube River. So the larger community in Hatam Sofer's time, the much larger community was the Pest side. I'm sorry, was the Buda side. And Obuda, which is the older part of Buda, or Altofen, that was probably the largest Jewish community in Hungary. And the second largest was Pressburg. And it wasn't just a large community, it was a pedigreed community. It was a community that went back hundreds of years already at this point. Okay. From there, so he took that job in 1806 and he remained there for the rest of his life. So for 33 years, he was the rabbi there. And it was there that that constituted most of his productive life. And he died there and was buried there. His grave is still there and it's a pilgrimage site. In terms of his works, he wrote a ton. He published barely anything in his lifetime, but posthumously, I mean, he just kept meticulous records and notebooks of all of his ideas and all of his chidushim and all of his responsa. And he wrote an ethical will. He used to write amulets. There was a tremendous amount of material. The three main sources that we have, and just main by volume, is his responsa, right? His answers to halachic questions. Usually questions that he was asked, and sometimes it was just he wrote for himself what he thought about a particular issue. We might get into one example of that. So there were about 1,400 of those. He also has two very dense volumes of sermons, homilies that he gave in Pressburg, mostly in Pressburg, although also in the other places. And he kept notebooks, and they were eventually published from those notebooks. And the third leg of that, the third of his major works is a running commentary on the Talmud, the Chidushim, right? Is his novellae, right? His novel interpretations of the Talmud. And now you're thinking, wait a second, here's a guy that said that you're not allowed to innovate, that innovation is forbidden by the Torah, anything new, right? Anything chadash, asur min Torah, how can somebody like that be writing chidushim? If that's what you're wondering, you're not the first to ask that question. And that's something that's going to be very much at the heart of what we're going to discuss this evening. Okay. What I want to do at this point is I want to look at some of the writings from which the prevailing view is generated. Where do they get this from? Where do we get this idea of, Hatam Sofer being this ultra-conservative inventor of small c conservative, inventor of orthodoxy, creator of orthodoxy, rigid, unchanging, etc. How does he get that reputation? So let's take a look. So one of the sources that a lot of people point to is his ethical will. Now, his ethical will, he wrote it a couple of years before he died in 1837. And he addresses it to his family, to his descendants. And he has a whole list of things. He tells his granddaughters, make sure your skirts aren't too short. And, he tells all of his descendants, don't go to the theaters. And he tells them what to learn. And he tells them, dispenses advice at the end of his life. And one of the things that he says them is, beware of changing your names, meaning keep Jewish names, Jewish language, i.e. Yiddish, umalbush, and continue to dress as Jews, malbush Yisrael, dress like Jews, meaning God forbid that you should change any of these things. V'siman, right, a mnemonic for remembering this, says, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem. Yaakov came Shalem, whole, complete, to the city of Shechem. Roshei Tevot, so that's an acronym. Shalem is an acronym for Shem Lashon Malbush. Now, there are two other places. So a couple of things about this. Number one, he writes to his descendants. He didn't think that this was halakhah. He didn't think that this was for everybody. He wrote this to his descendants. Additionally, he mentions this 2 or 3 times. This triad of name, language, and dress, which is how he gets to that triad, is a separate question, and it's something that I wrote a paper on that. You can find it on my academia page, where that's an interesting story in its own right. But he mentions it a grand total of 3 times in his life. He mentions it in his ethical will. He mentions it in a drasha from the year of about 1810, the early 1810s. And he mentions it in his commentary on the Haggadah, where the part of the Haggadah where it says, that the Israelites in Egypt did not, they remained distinct. They remained distinguished from the Egyptians. His comment is, yeah, they didn't change their name, language, and dress. That's it, right? And the Haggadah was not published in his lifetime also. So those are the 3. Those are the 3 times that he mentions it. But you also have the triad in the writings of contemporaries of Rav Mendel of Rimanov in Galicia, and you have it in the writings of various itinerant preachers in Prussia. So yes, Hatam Sofer mentions it. Other people also mention it. It's clear that this triad was sort of taking hold at that time, at the beginning of the 1800s. It really bursts the banks long after the Hatam Sofer died in a book called Lev HaIvri by Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger, which is a commentary on Hatam Sofer's ethical will. So it's associated with Hatam Sofer, but only a generation after he died. And that's really when it becomes a slogan. That's when it becomes a motto. So this ethical will was sort of repurposed for that. Continuing on to some of the other sources. So here is an exchange that he had with Rafi Hirsch Chayes, or Maharitz Chayes, who was a fascinating character, and he tended to be there's a dissertation on Maharitz Chayes that was written by Bruria Hutner David, the daughter of Rav Yitzchak Hutner and the founder of BJJ, the seminary in Jerusalem, Beis Yaakov Seminary in Jerusalem, who herself a fascinating person who is said to have edited the volumes of Pachad Yitzchak, her father's Sefer. And the subtitle of her dissertation is something like Between Two Worlds, or between the Haskalah and Orthodoxy. He was torn between, he had one foot in either of those worlds. And more, we'll discuss him more as time goes, during the course of this lecture. So he was a young man when Hatam Sofer died. Hatam Sofer was sort of like the elder, his reputation was, he was in his 70s. He was a well-known figure. And so he used to write to the Hatam Sofer. Hatam Sofer, there are about 6 tshuvot, there are 6 responses that Hatam Sofer writes to Rafi Hirsch Chayes. Sometimes he deletes the name, which is an interesting, that wasn't his choice because these weren't published in his lifetime, but it's an interesting choice because it shows that there's a certain, when you elide the name, it's showing like, oh, we don't want to show that the Hatam Sofer was talking to such people. So he responds and this is actually also published by Maharitz Chayes in one of his books. So he says to him, I'm going to respond, this is an excerpt of a longer responsum. Ashiv miyad, I will respond right away. And that's something that he writes a lot. He responds right away. They said that he would usually respond the same day that he got the question. Lotzimi libo tahor, so that to dispel from your pure heart, al masha katavti b'michtavi hakodem, hachadash asor ben Torah. I'm going to explain to you what I mean by hachadash asor ben Torah. I didn't say that, I didn't compare things to Orla, I didn't compare things. Is there a shortage of things that are prohibited in Judaism that I can't, like when I say something I don't like, I compare it to Chadash. Why don't I compare it to Orla? Why don't I compare it to Kilayim? Why don't I compare it to Pigul? Chadash, why? Kimiz kenim et bonan, because I consider from the elders, from my teachers, that it's proper to be one of the upholders of the Torah. V'nizharu miliftoach petach, and they were cautious about opening things up, about making openings, ulchapei kulot, or to seek leniencies, l'pritzei amenu, for the rogues, for the dissolute amongst our people. Sher otam hemevakshim, because that's what they want, meaning that's what this dissolute want. V'yimim tzu sedek k'machat asher If they find the tiniest opening, like a thin needle, if there are two parrots, open parrots, they're going to exploit that and they're going to open it. It's going to be breach after breach after breach. The particular issue that he's talking about here is something about burial. I can't remember, about leaving bodies to be overnight before burial, where Maritz Chayes was like saying, yeah, you can, there's definitely grounds to do it. And the Hatam Sofer was vehemently opposed because he saw where it was coming from. And he thought that since this is coming from pressure famously, there was a controversy in the time of Moses Mendelssohn about the German lands certain German lands made a law that burial had to be 3 days after death. And there was a large controversy then about whether or not Jewish law could accept this. And Hatam Sofer is saying here, like, if it came from somewhere else, maybe I would have a different attitude. But the people that are asking for this, the people that want this, it's not because they think that that's what the Torah thinks we should do. It's not because they think that this is right. It's because they're trying to make the Torah fit. They're trying to make the Torah conform to whatever the prevailing notions of proper burial are. And that's something that I'm going to oppose. And then he says, "In nafkuta ladina b'zman hazeh." Since there's no, saying something is doraita or saying something is derabanan, there's no today. Meaning, forbidden is forbidden, and it's not like we punish, right? Because if something is derabanan, you're not going to get lashes for it. But we don't administer lashes today anyway, so there's no difference whether it's a doraita or a derabanan. So why not upgrade the prohibition? Why not say, instead of saying that, oh yeah, this is forbidden rabbinically, upgrade it. Say that this is forbidden rabbinically. Umar Nero Yair, you, sir, you rely on Dea Dechuya Chavot Yair. You're relying on this rejected opinion of the Chavot Yair. He was a minority opinion. It was one opinion, Shekatav Shekol Ikaro Ein Ela Rak Midirabanan, that this whole issue of halanat hamet, of leaving the body overnight, is only midirabanan. And he says, but and that's a stronger basis for leniency. But he says, in megalina davar, we don't tell people that. We don't tell people that such a position exists. Because due to our sins, Rabu elu bizmanenu ad shiomru inanu choshin l'divrei Rabbanan Hashem lo tziva. There are a lot of people today who would, if you tell them it's a derabanan, they'll say, "Oh, we don't care about derabanans. God didn't tell us to do this, so we don't care about that." If you tell me it's a derabanan, or that there's one opinion that says it's a derabanan, they're going to be like, "Ah, okay, great." And this is even more. This is reinforced by this next responsa. He's asked by the authorities. He's asked by the authorities in, or a group of rabbis was asked by the Habsburg authorities, what types of relationships does the Jewish tradition consider to be incestuous? I mean, what are the forbidden marriages, forbidden sexual relations between, that are forbidden? This was asked by the Stadt Alteria. It means like the town elders. Levareru lefaresh eza ha'arayot ha'asurim la'am Yisrael. And so the way that the question was posed to them, they asked us which relationships are forbidden to the Jewish people, al pi dat Toratenu, according to the law of our Torah, our holy Torah. And which relationships do the rabbis have the power to permit temporarily? That's how the question was posed. And he says, Lashiv divrei hamet omar tchila. Before I even answer, I'm going to say, yes, some relationships, some forbidden relationships are explicit in the Torah. And there are some that were forbidden by the rabbis in order to create a safeguard. And there's no difference between them. Because it's all from the Torah, meaning that what the rabbis added to the Torah is also part of the Torah. And then he concludes the response, all of these relations, whether it's deoraita or derabanan, ein koach l'shum beit din b'shum makom, no beit din in no place is authorized, b'shum zman, and at no time, la'atir u'la'akel klal u'klal, to be lenient and to permit such relations. Okay, so here we're starting to get a picture of where this idea comes from. Here's somebody we see all of these points, that number one, he's not willing to make any allowances for modernity, for even when the pressure is coming from the government or from people who think that the ideas and ideals espoused by the government are right and are true, correct. That he's rigid, he's not willing to change, that he's ultra conservative, that he's strict. Although, I don't know how many people are, pining away to marry their nieces, but or uncles. But whichever it is, that's what that's the chumrah that he's talking about. And we see that he's elevating prohibitions. He's taking derabanans and he's turning them into deoraitas. He's taking rabbinic law and turning it into biblical law. Now he has a whole approach to that, meaning that yes, the Torah itself does authorize future sages to enact decrees to interpret the Torah. So the authority of the rabbis to create law is itself anchored in the Torah. But the only difference would be that in terms of punishment, right? If the violation of a rabbinic law does not entail biblical punishment, but the violation of Torah law does. Meaning, if someone violates a derabanan on Shabbat, they wouldn't be chayav skila. They wouldn't be, that wouldn't incur the death penalty. Today, there's no death penalty. So really, what's the difference between violating a doraita and a derabanan? Now, of course, there are other differences. Right, a derabanan, if it's b'makom tsa'ar, b'makom hefsid meruba, b'makom tzorech rabim, chol she'ein bo sakana, there are all kinds of heterim that are available for deorabanans that are not available on deoraitas, but that's in the application. That's not. It's the derabanans. There are more grounds for leniency, but that doesn't make them any less mandatory a priori than biblical Torah law. Okay. So now, having seen where this idea comes from, we can start complicating things. We can start making things a little bit, we can show how this view of Hatam Sofer can be a little bit simplistic. So this first one, the tshuva of the Hatam Sofer, Yoredei number 19, he dates most of his tshuvot, meaning he writes the date and he writes the place on most of his tshuvot. So you can reconstruct his whole life based on that. And maybe if we get through, depending on how much time we have, I can show some maps that a project that I'm involved in, we've produced maps where the Hatam Sofer wrote to and when. And it's cool beans, and if we get a chance, we'll take a look. So this is the first time that he uses Chadash Asur min HaTorah in all of his written works. This is the first time that he says Chadash Asur min HaTorah. And let's see what he's talking about. So the question is this. He's writing to a student. He says, Ma sheher ashta ha'olam, you made a big stink. You made a lot of noise. Al shemochrim livnei Noach b'nei me'ayim shel nevelot u'trefot. That the innards of nevelot and trefot, of improperly slaughtered animals, are sold to Gentiles. And this is a practice that it's an age-old practice, and they still do it in the United States today, right? It's too difficult to what's called trabering. It's too difficult to take out the sciatic nerve from the hindquarters. So when a kosher slaughterhouses, after they slaughter the animal, they'll keep the forequarters for the kosher market, and they'll sell the hindquarters. And as we all know, not every shechita is a good shechita. There are mistakes, and sometimes the animal is diseased, and sometimes the animal is, and sometimes the slaughtering itself was improper. So what do you do? They're not kosher. What do you do with them? Sell them to non-Jews, and that has long been Jewish practice. Somebody had a problem with it based on some question that he had. Maybe it was that. I don't even know. In his answer, Hatam Sofer says, "Kama tarchu liyashev minag heter b'chadash." Do you know that the sages they bent over backwards to permit eating chadash? In Ashkenazic custom was that we're not what's called makpid on yashan. Right? We do not wait until after Pesach to eat grain that was grown in the current crop. And that, it would seem, directly contravenes Halakhah. Sephardim historically have been makpid on this. Ashkenazim historically have not. And the sages of Ashkenaz bent over backwards to justify this. So he's talking about chadash. That's the original meaning of chadash. Chadash lifnei ha'omer, right? So our minhag heter, our permissive custom of eating chadash before the omer, before the second day of Pesach. Why? The hakol liyashev minhag, all to justify the existing practice. We kol makom bal nefesh yachush la'atzmo. Of course, if you're a spiritually inclined person, which is a very poor translation of bal nefesh, somebody's a bal nefesh, somebody is really pious, somebody is really sincerely religious. They can observe this chumrah individually, meaning not publicly. You don't impose it on anyone else. Yachush la'atzmo. For him, they can observe it themselves. It says v'chein mili tuva, and there's also a lot of other issues. Ein lemaher l'chadesh iser. We shouldn't be so quick to start innovating new prohibitions. And so now he's already used the word chadash twice. One to talk about the iser chadash, and the second time lemaher l'chadesh iser, to innovate new prohibitions. Meaning, and he's arguing here, even though the Gemara says chadash asur min haTorah, Ashkenazic practice is chadash mutar. We do eat chadash. Okay? And so now watch what he does. Umikol shekain heter, he says, we shouldn't be too quick to innovate new stringencies, and certainly we shouldn't be innovating new leniencies. Because Jewish custom is itself Torah. What Jews do, that's Torah. It's a text that has to be understood and read because it's Torah. Behaklal, and a general rule is hechadash asur min haTorah, right? So he's clearly, he has a good sense of humor. He's clearly using this in an ironic way. He's talking about the fact that we say chadash is mutter, and then he says, yeah, if you want to take the rule, take it chadash asur min haTorah. We eat chadash. Why? Because to innovate a new stringency is asur. B'chol makom v'hayashar hamiyushan, and that which is old mishubach mimenu, is better than it. A year later, he's asked. Now, this is a controversy that really, we heard a little bit about this controversy from Professor Brown 2 weeks ago, the shiurim, right? What are the biblical quantities, minimum requisite quantities in the language of Professor Chaim Soloveitchik? How much matzah do you have to eat? How much maror do you have to eat? How long is an amma? How big does the sukkah have to be? There are so many halakhot that have to do with biblical weights, or halachic weights and measures and distances. What does it mean? What are these measures. So the Noda B'Yehuda in the late 18th century ended up coming to the conclusion that we are vastly underestimating what these quantities are supposed to be. And he instituted new chumrot based on that, although he didn't really publish it. He buried it in the back of a book of chidushim. He didn't write it in his halachic works. And it wasn't until the 20th century with Hazon Ish that you heard about a couple of weeks ago that it really became a thing. But there were people that were worried about this. So one student of the Hatam Sofer, he reads what Noda B'Yehuda has to say about shiurim, and he's concerned that the etrogim that are on the market aren't big enough, right? That if Noda B'Yehuda is right, that the eggs nowadays are much smaller than the eggs were in the time of Chazal, and that really the measurement of an egg, of a kibetza, is much bigger than we think it is, then our etrogim don't measure up. And so the Hatam Sofer, it's a longer responsa, but he says, don't worry about it. He says, Im nishtanu habeitzim, gam ha'esrogim nishtanu. If the eggs are different sizes, then the esrogim are also different sizes, right? So if the eggs are smaller and the eggs, at maturity are smaller than they used to be, then the same thing with the esrogim. And the esrogim, since they shrunk, and since a fully grown esrog is smaller than it used to be a fully grown esrog, you can shrink the minimum shear of the esrog accordingly. And he says, what's good for us, it would behoove us, right? Don't make us crazy. Hakmir nishta chainik, right? Lo lahavis es Yisrael b'chadashos. Don't frighten Jews with all these new things. And he says, shaloshi aru avotenu, right? And that's a double entendre. The pasuk in Ha'azinu is shaloshi arum avotenu. These are things that it never dawned on our parents. It never occurred to our parents, but he's also playing on the word shiurim, because that's the topic here, right? Lo shi'aru avotenu.
Rabbi,
these were not the shiurim that our forefathers used.
Rabbi Fischer?
Yes.
Now the play on it, the pasuk is lo sa'arum, with a sin. He's playing sa'arum and turns it into a shear. And the first part is chadashim mikarov bo. So he's actually playing on Chadash again. He's a terrific sense of humor. Chadash is mutim in that Torah because Chadash is also from the Torah. That's the first one. Now the Sa'arum becomes Shiarum. So.
Right. Thank you. Lo shi'aru avotenu, that these are not the measurements that our fathers used. Umilati kvar amura. I've already said my piece. Hachadash, and you see that little chupchik, that little quotation mark in the middle of the word hachadash. So usually or often when a rabbi in a rabbinic work puts that there, either it means it's an acronym or he's saying, pay attention to this. I'm doing something clever here. And that's what he's doing. Chadash asur min haTorah b'chol makom. Right? Chadash is like, I'm not talking about that Chadash. I'm talking about this Chadash. And he signals to us, it's like sarcastic quotes, right? He's signaling to us that he's making a joke, that he's making a pun. Okay? And both of these cases that we've seen here, from 1819 and 1820, he invokes this rule of Chadash Asur min HaTorah. He invokes it Likula. He's saying, don't make me crazy with your new Isurim. Don't show me these new prohibitions that you're trying to invent. These are new prohibitions. Our fathers never heard of these prohibitions. Our grandmothers never heard of these prohibitions. Stop bothering us with them, right? So yes, it's true that there's a certain conservatism here, but it's the opposite of a strict conservatism here. It's a liberal conservatism. This is something that we've always treated as being permissible, so we'll continue to treat it as permissible because Minhag Yisrael Torahu. If this is what Jews do, then this is Torah. Okay. And one final thing here, where he says something, and this is somewhat, his drashot are sometimes hard to understand. Here in a drasha, he quotes the Mishnah in Avot that talks about Damash Tashiv le'apikoros. You should know what to respond to a heretic. says, Hine ikar tshuvateinu la'apikoros. This is the crux of our response to a heretic. Sheyesh gavoa me'al gavoa. Some things are higher than high. Ve'ein lanu l'hitchatkeim, and we shouldn't try to be too clever. We shouldn't be overly clever. We shouldn't be overly sophisticated. Ein l'chadeh shum davar. We shouldn't come up with innovations. Ve'ein l'seichel mavo l'chol advarim. And not everything does the intellect have access to. Meaning there's a certain epistemic humility that he's expressing here. And indeed, when the apikores sees, what do we do all day? Well, we're sitting and learning. What are we learning? It's like, well, we're coming up with chidusha. We're coming up with innovations. The more innovations you can come up with in the Beit Midrash, that's more commendable. So Yachzor Apikoros v'Yomar, the Apikoros is going to say, I don't understand what's going on here. Like either way, like, do you have access? Can you understand things? Can you not understand things? It says, so that'll force him to reconsider, and he'll say, if something runs counter to logical syllogism, all we have is what's written. Meaning he's saying that on one hand, right? On one hand, I'm saying innovation is forbidden. On the other hand, what do we do all day? We innovate. The Apikoros is going to come and say, like, are you innovative or are you not? And he's saying that what we're going to force him to think, what we're going to force him to reconsider is that if your innovation is rational, is irrational, then I lost his train of thought here. I had it earlier today, but it's counter. What so from what we've seen now, there are a few things that have emerged. One, when we talk about Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, we're talking about a public policy, right? He's talking about, in his explanation to Maritz Chayos, he talks about his opposition to conscious innovation, attempts to improve, right? We think it should be this way, and therefore, meaning you know what the improvement is going to be, and therefore we're going to innovate, we're going to engineer an innovation. This is what we would call reform. Right? That's what reform literally means, a small or reform. Second, we see that he says, Asur min HaTorah, both Lakula and Lechumra. Right? That he's not only Lakula, he's not just opposed to leniencies, he's also opposed to stringencies. Now, there's a key issue here that we'll see it more clearly in some of the other sources. According to the Hatam Sofer, and this is part of the key difference between, a key point of contention between Hatam Sofer and Maritz Chayos. Maritz Chayos was what we would call today a positivist. He thinks that all of the rules for interpreting the Torah were given at Sinai, and there's no longer any need to have any sort of divine input into the ongoing process, right? He takes a radical understanding, or maybe not so radical understanding, maybe not more radical than Rambam, of the idea that Torah lo bashamayim hi. The Torah is no longer in heaven, and therefore any sort of charismatic or any sort of divine input is forbidden. Whereas Hatam Sofer we started to see in his ideas about Minhag Yisrael Torah that there is some sort of collective unconscious, right? That we can trust the instincts of the Jewish people as a whole, or specifically God-fearing Jews or the sages, right? And because their instincts, their intuitions are divinely guided, are divinely shaped. We don't have to be afraid of. We don't need anything new, right? The idea of consciously coming up with an innovation implies that there's something wrong with things the way that they are, and therefore we have to engineer a change. But if you believe, as the Hatam Sofer does, that the entire process is guided, then we don't have to outthink God, right? And that's what he's Ein lanu lehidchaken. You don't have to overthink this. Ein lecha shum davar ve'ein lesechel mavo lekol hadvarim. Right? There's not everything that so what's he talking about when he talks about chidush? When he talks about chidush of the kind of experience that he would the kind of chidush that he would experience when learning, he's talking about something that it's spontaneous. It's not overthought. You learn a Gemara, you learn a tshuva, you learn something, and this is how your mind processes it, and this is how it comes off to you. It appears to you at first glance, right? And he says that process is itself shaped by the divine, is something that you have access, something that God influences, as it were, how the Torah is developing, how Halakhah is developing. This is a form of what would be called progressive revelation. It's not a radical type of progressive revelation, but it is a type of progressive revelation. And we'll see soon that he's very clear on this point. The idea that we don't always have access to the truth of the Torah is something that we can't presume to know it all, to know all of the Torah, to know what the Torah's rationales are. That's something that recurs in his writings. So this is a hesped that he gave in 1812 for Rabbi David Zintzeim. Rabbi David Zintzeim was the rabbi of Strasbourg. He was the head of the committee of nobles that Napoleon convened, and he posed to them several questions about Judaism and whether Judaism is compatible with a modern nation state. That document itself, his Zintzeim's responses to Napoleon are worthy of close reading, and it's a brilliant, phenomenal document. It's a lesson in diplomatic writing. Like, he says things like, Napoleon asks, "Are Jews opposed to marrying Christians?" And his answer is, "Well, we're no more opposed to marrying Christians than Christians are to marrying us." Meaning, all very diplomatically worded, all very, sometimes it's even cleverer. He was sort of the ambassador of the Torah to the greatest, the most powerful man of his day. So the Hatam Sofer gives a really nice eulogy, a really beautiful eulogy. And again, it's worth, this was also a drasha on the 8th day of Tevet. The 8th day of Tevet is a significant day in the Jewish calendar, and especially on Hatam Sofer's calendar. The 8th of Tevet, there's a tradition that goes back over 1,000 years, that the 8th of Tevet was the day that the Torah was translated into Greek. Now, Hatam Sofer, being who he was, and constantly being concerned about how Judaism is being interpreted, being translated, and being conveyed in the world at large, he was drawn to this day like a moth to a campfire. He gave a drasha on this day in most years. In his book on drashot, I mean, it's 2 pretty thick volumes, his sermons. He has about 40 to 50 pages on Sukkot. Okay? He has about 65 pages on the 8th of Tevet. Okay? So he's writing more about this date than he's writing about Sukkot, which is a pretty phenomenal thing considering that this is not a significant date on the Jewish calendar for most people. I somewhat observe it because I'm a translator, so I take that day as a day of introspection about my job and my role and what it means to translate Torah for the world. Hatam Sofer wasn't a translator, but he's drawn to it, and he took that opportunity also to eulogize Rabbi Zintzeim, who had passed away about a month earlier. And in this drasha, he talks about, he gives a parable as to why he thinks that the translation of the Torah is problematic. And we'll see a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then he talks about the role of Zintzeim. And he says that one of the problems is that once you translate the Torah into the language of philosophy, in the language of culture, people are going to start interpreting the Torah only according to that language, only according to the language of reason. And that's a problem. Why? It says, they're going to begin to expound on these silly ideas. Why is not the milk of a non-kosher animal not kosher, prohibited? Because it causes this or that sickness or blockage. Based on science, meaning they'll turn Torah into a rational book of natural science. Moses, yes, Moshe Rabbeinu, he was a great scientist. He knew a lot. He was a very wise man who knew science. Achim Kain, but these people would continue saying, Achim Kain, but if that's the case, right? It's simply silly, it's simply stupid to forbid the milk of a kosher animal just because a non-Jew milked the animal. Without a Jew witnessing it. And they're going to say all these things about every mitzvah. They're going to start to rationalize them. And once you rationalize them, that opens the door to stop observing them. And certainly when it comes to things like derabanans, like the chalvon nachri be'en Yisrael ro'ehu, which is an isur derabanan, which is rabbinically forbidden. Lucha chamu yaskilu. If they had only considered, if they would wise up, they would understand ki yesh b'chol elu. In all of these matters, all of these isurim derabanan, ta'amim acherim. There are other reasons. Gvoim me'al gvohim, and that's the same phrase that we saw before. Gavoa me'al gavoa, right? That we don't know the reasons for the Torah. There are reasons for the halachot that are higher than high. Al kol davar mamunim malachim metivim merim. There are angels that are appointed over these benevolent and antagonizing angels are appointed over each matter. Then they'll understand. All of the rabbinic enactments and all of the rabbinic safeguards, they all have roots on high. And then maybe they'll shut up. Maybe they'll shut their mouth. So this is, again, we see, when we talk about elevating a derabanan to the level of a deoraita. So it's true that he's saying that everything, even rabbinic enactments, even custom, are Torah, are on some level the word of God, and that we don't always know the reason for it. The community, we don't know why the community does what it does. We don't know why these practices emerged, but Minhag Yisrael Torahu. If Jewish people do it, then it's Torah. I would say that there's an almost proto-Freudian aspect going on here, that there's some sort of, or I guess this would be Jungian, the idea of a collective unconscious, the idea that the community practice itself has reasons that aren't always known to the community itself, that the reasons are, the rationales are inaccessible to us. We don't know them, we can't know them. Maybe we can discover them, but we will never exhaust their meanings. So that's something that's, like in that sense, learning halacha is a sort of, is a sort of psychology, is a sort of psychotherapy. We're just digging deeper and deeper into our own collective unconscious, into our own collective psyche, trying to understand why we do the things that we do. Okay. Before going further, this is a one more tshuva first, a couple more tshuvas before going further. This is a halacha where he's trying to explain there's a mitzvah in the Torah that everybody has to write a Sefer Torah. We don't all write Sefer Torah. Not everybody owns a Sefer Torah. That's because we rely on the Rosh. The Rosh said that one may fulfill this mitzvah by buying books, by buying svarim. Now, of course, the Rosh was talking about manuscripts, but today we fulfill this by buying books. So how can one buy books to fulfill a mandate to write a Sefer Torah? And Hatam Sofer answers, Kol mitzvot Torah hem kulam be'ein mevin. We can't understand any of the Torah. The Torah is entirely and completely inaccessible. Mibli shasu poskim, without the words of the Shas, of the Talmud, of the Gemara, and the codes. L'mtzo perushim al kol mitzvot Torah hu nimna, to interpret all of the words of the commandments of the Torah, it's impossible. Kiloya yeda anosh erkava afilu Moshe Rabbeinu olav shalom lo yadaze. Even Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know it all. Right? The Torah is, in Hatam Sofer's mind, the Torah is literally infinite. Infinite. The gates of interpretation are never closed. There's no limited corpus of what the Torah is or what the Torah can be. So in Cain, so if that's the case, you need a complete original Torah scroll, because otherwise that's the only thing that's complete. Nothing else can be complete, right? The Torah itself somehow contains it all. Any other work doesn't contain it all. But you still need something that you can learn, and therefore you have to buy other svarim so that you can learn. The Torah, you can't learn the Torah, because the Torah is just, it's too infinite to begin learning it. What you can learn is other books, so that you can start to learn them. The Sefer Torah atzmo k'tzara da'atenu, because when it comes to the Torah itself, we're too limited to understand it. Right? So now it's not just, I'm suggesting that he's not just talking about hyperbole. This is not just hyperbolic. I think that epistemologically, he thinks that we really, he just can't, it's impossible for human beings to grasp this all. So then, according to him, how does the entire process of halacha work? How do we claim to understand something? How can I paskin a halacha and say that, yeah, I learned it and this is what the halacha should be? So he answers that. And he answers that in the next letter that he writes to Maritz Chayes. Also, is if you look at the date on the first one, this is about a week later. So they were corresponding, and I guess the mail, he was in Galicia. One was in Galicia, the other one was in Pressburg. I guess the mail is pretty good. If he writes him a letter, and then 8 days later he's writing him another letter. That means that the letter got to Zovkev, which is where Maritz Chayes was, and Maritz Chayes responded and sent a letter back to Hatam Sofer, all within 8 days. So really not bad. I think it's better than the postal service today. I just sent something to Poland like a month ago, and it still hasn't gotten there. So they're talking about the issue that I raised before. What are the source? What the parameters of lo bashamayim? What does it mean that the Torah is no longer in heaven? Is there any room for any sort of revelatory input even today. And so there are all kinds of, there's an entire book called Shelot Utshuvot Min HaShamayim, right? And it's written by one of the Rishonim, and these are all responsa that he dreamed. And it's sometimes Poskim Halakhah L'maisa. And there's places where even the Beit Yosef says that, I wasn't sure about this halacha, and then I had a dream that the Abu Draham is right, and so I poskin like the Abu Draham. So he quotes a Ravid, where the Ravid says in Hilchot Lulav, Kfar Hofia Ruach HaKodesh Bebeit Midrashenu. There was Ruach HaKodesh, the divine spirit, appeared in our Beit Midrash and told us to poskin a certain way. There was a machloket, there was a dispute between two Tanaim, and this Ruach HaKodesh showed up in the Beit Midrash of the Ravid and said, you got to poskin this way. This is the halacha. So Hatam Sofer tries to unpack that. He says, Hainu Ruach Hashem al oskei haTorah. And I apologize for not translating this. This was a little bit of a longer passage. Ruach Hashem al oskei Torah lishma. The Ruach, God's spirit, inspires those who engage in the Torah for its own sake. Asher zochim l'chavein ha'emet. They are privileged to they are able to intuit the truth. They're able to, they're in tune with the truth. Afilu im lefi tevach chochmatam v'sichlam lo yasigu yedehem tushia kazu. Even if by naturally they're just simply not smart enough to really encompass all of this. Mikol makom, nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chasto yahiv chachma l'chakima. God, in His grace, gives them wisdom lefi sha'ah, temporarily. And then he goes on. I'm going to move a little faster now. He goes on to say, he calls this, in the last line here of this first paragraph, nevu'ah shel chokhmah. It's a type of prophecy. He says it's the prophecy of wisdom. It's the prophecy that comes to you through wisdom, meaning you're not an oracle, you're not prophesying, you're learning. But as you learn, if you learn lishma, and as you really dedicate yourself to Torah, you will get some sort of prophetic insight that will allow you to intuit the right answer, to intuit the truth. And he says that this is how he describes the process of Torah itself, the process of learning itself. And then he goes on to say that the idea of lo b'shamayim hi, obviously we need an idea like lo b'shamayim hi, because otherwise if the Torah can be changed, if God can come and say, and change the Torah by giving a new revelation, then anything can happen. And he quotes a Gemara where some Amin, which probably is referring to some sort of early Christian, says to one of the Amoraim that since the temple was destroyed, your Torah no longer applies. A new Torah has been given. Right? It sounds like Christianity. A New Testament has been given. And then he goes on and he criticizes the Muhammad, right? Naviha Yishmaelim, right? The prophet of the Ishmaelites, Muhammad. And then he says Shabtai Tzvi, right? These are all people that they claimed some kind of new revelation and turned the Torah on its head. Right? So obviously you need to have a principle like Lo B'Shamayim, because otherwise you're susceptible to charlatans and you're susceptible to all kinds of, tricksters. So Al Kain Klala Kayal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God gave us a rule. She'ein hanavi rashai l'chadesh shum mitzvah mehayashanot. The Torah, that a navi, no prophet, is allowed to innovate any mitzvah beyond the old ones. Yitbaer v'yitparej min hashamayim mehayashanot. But the old ones, they can still be clarified through the heavens, right? But ki'im al dat chachmei Israel, but only through the sages of Israel, meaning that this prophetic revelation can only come through the minds of the sages of Israel, meaning through the Torah sages, that they will get some sort of divine inspiration that's guiding their Pesak, that's guiding their halacha. And that is the only legitimate form of divine inspiration. What I want to do here, right, this is just a little bit of an aside because this is going to become an important point when I try to tie this all together. I'm going to get through this really quickly, where we mentioned that he left Ashkenaz, that he left the Rhineland when he was in his, when he was a teenager. Now, in that time, while he left, after he left, the Rhineland of his youth ceased to exist. Now, in the Rhineland, you had some of the most ancient Jewish communities, these communities of Speyer and Worms and Mainz, and then Frankfurt already, several hundred years before the Hatam Sofer, the city of Frankfurt was known as a center of Jewish learning. These are communities that recorded their customs meticulously. Several books of customs from these specific communities were published starting already in the 1400s. It was almost like almost like a Jewish enchanted forest, like an enchanted landscape. And in the early 1800s, that enchanted landscape died. And everybody that lived there knew it. But Hatam Sofer didn't live there anymore. So that landscape remained enchanted in his mind, right? Old Ashkenaz, the Ashkenaz of, the Chavos Yair, the Ashkenaz of the Balafla and the Pnei Yehoshua, this continued to exist in the mind of the Hatam Sofer. And it comes up in a few places. So in this tshuva, I'm going to come back to this tshuva. This is on Kitniot. In this one, he's responding to somebody who was criticizing the fact that German Jews tended to be clean shaven, except for the rabbis. Right? The rabbis had beards, but everybody else, all of the Balabatim, all of the laity, they remained clean shaven. And they were criticized for it. And he goes off on the person that was criticizing his childhood landscape. Avotenu inhigu atzmam kein al tzad ha'hechrach hagadol. They did this because this is how they started to, this is why they shaved, right? They had to. Why? Lo makor mishachat chas v'shalom. It wasn't from some sort of destructive, source, God forbid. It was because they were extra holy that they shaved. This was in the days of Gzerot Tatnu, the first crusade in the year Taf Nun Vav, 1096. The first crusade, the Haroim and the shepherds, meaning that's the Pastoro, another crusade, Uchadoma, and the stuff like that stuff. There were a lot of itinerant peddlers, and their Gedolim said, you're allowed to, you can dress differently, and you can shave. They can shave so that you could be incognito, so that your enemies won't recognize you when you're out on the road. Because by that point, the non-Jews were all shaving. And he goes on a whole aside to explain why the non-Jews started shaving, based on history books that he read. So, they kept a symbolic amount of beard hair. They wouldn't shave completely. They would keep a symbolic amount of facial hair. There's basically a one day, like a 5 o'clock shadow. They would keep it like that. Like overnight growth. Only the sages who would stay at home and wouldn't travel, they grew out their beards. And you Polish Jews, you wimps, you cowards, you didn't stay and tough it out and shave. You ran off to Poland and then you kept your beards. Way to go, guys. Right? He's like trolling the Poles. He's saying the fact that the Poles have beards and the Germans don't have beards, it's not because the Poles are holier. On the contrary, it's because we the German Jews were holier because we stuck with it. We devoted our lives. We dedicated ourselves. And yeah, in order to come, in order to deal with that, we had to shave. In another tshuva, he actually gives us his mental map of what Ashkenaz is. So this same rabbi that he was responding to in 159 criticized the Jews of Franconia, right, southwestern Germany, as doing something against halacha. God forbid you say something like that about the Jewish people. Now here again, you're getting back into this consciousness of Minhag Yisrael Torah and the idea of a Kehila Kedosha, that the entire community is sacred. He said, my entire childhood, my parents, my teachers, my ancestors, the ones that are dead, the ones that are alive, you're not talking about me, you're talking about them. You don't talk about my people that way. And these were super holy people. And then he gives us his boundaries. When I talk about Francia, and this is old Ashkenaz, right? Basically, from outside of Fjorda is Firth, right? From outside of Firth, which is right next to Nuremberg, anything beyond that, that's what we're talking about here. Nuremberg is right between the Danube Basin and the Rhine Basin. Right, so that's basically where Ashkenaz starts. There in Firth, they use Minhag Poland. But I can't attest to their Minhag. Anything beyond that, where is that? Würzburg, from the area around Würzburg, all along the Main River, Varinus and the Rhine River, Ad Hayam HaGadol, until the North Sea, and including the cities on the North Sea, like Hamburg. Hem are Francia. That's what we mean by Francia. Uvichlalam, what does that include? Frankfurt, Mainz, Worms, Metz, Mannheim, and the like. Rov minhagam al pi Rabbi Amram Gon, and he says that these they have a real pedigree for all of their minhagim, and their minhagim are documented in Sefer Yosef Ometz and Noah Katzon Yosef. These are collections of minhagim. And yeah, it's true. Sometimes they go against the Ramah. Because the Ramah was Polish and he was writing about Polish minhag. But we Ashkenazim, real Ashkenazim, we didn't change our ancient minhag because of this. Okay, so now we have another piece of where he's coming from, which is his enchanted landscape of his youth, the enchanted landscape of Ashkenaz, which he expands. And now we're going to go back to this, the one that we skipped, where he's talking about Kitniot. And people asked, there was one area, Westphalia, that actually did away with the custom of Kitniot. And he was asked about that, and he was very vehement in saying no. And he says, even if there would be a reason to, you would need most or all of the sages of Ashkenaz to get together. They're the ones who accepted this gezerah from the beginning. We all have the status of one city. So if in this tshuva over here, Ashkenaz is this limited space, here when he's talking about Kitniot, he's saying that Ashkenaz, the entire territory of Europe, has the status of one city, because however it was, it's spread out from there, and now all of Ashkenaz has that status. Now it's a very innovative reading, but as we know, Hatam Sofer was not against innovation, right? He was very innovative, extremely creative. So you have that he has this consciousness of Ashkenaz, but he expands that consciousness, extends that consciousness throughout Europe. I think we're going to skip these last. We already saw most of these points, and you can read them on your own. Here, he's talking about, in a nutshell, he he gives his opposition to translating the Torah, because he says that, and here we get into the question of like, who's really orthodox, right? Once again, these are when he's writing on Chet Tevet. He says, when you translate the Torah, you lock in one meaning, right? When you translate it into German, this is the interpretation. And it's usually the pshat, right? Kavanah pshuta. You cut off every other avenue of interpretation when you translate the Torah. And that's the real tragedy of translation. You take something which has this infinite capacity for innovation, for new interpretation, and you cut off all the interpretations but one. I actually put in a paragraph from Spinoza here, where Spinoza talks about biblical interpretation. The method of interpreting scripture does not widely differ from the method of interpreting nature. Scriptural interpretation proceeds by the examination of scripture. He says he sees it as being a purely empirical endeavor. And the Hatam Sofer is like chas v'shalom, right? And that's animating a lot of the projects to translate the Torah that are going on in his time, the Biur and whatnot. He says that this is why he said he sees the emphasis on only pshat, only the straightforward meaning of the Torah, as nitzotzot shel apikorsos, as like a fledgling form of heresy, because you're cutting off all of these other avenues of interpretation. So now I pose the question back to you, back to the audience. You have one person who's saying, no, we need to keep those gates of interpretation open because they're never going to be exhausted, because interpretation is infinite and ongoing and always. And there's another group that's saying, no, this is pshat, that we've reduced it to a science and we know exactly this is what the Torah says and this is what the Torah means. Which one of those is orthodox? Which one of those is, in its literal sense, orthodox, correct thinking, thinks that there's one correct way of doing things or one correct way of being? Who's the purist? Who's puritanical? Who is it? Hatam Sofer or is it the Biurists? Hatam Sofer or Mendelssohn? Hatam Sofer or Spinoza? Right? And I have to say that this line of reasoning is, I'm indebted to Maoz Kahana, who is both my thesis advisor and, who basically wrote this book on the Noda B'Yehuda and the Hatam Sofer, which is a total game changer. It reset the bar for rabbinic biography. It's just simply outstanding. The last source we'll look at is here. He actually, in this responsum, he actually describes his process of how he writes a tshuva. He says, "Pupulim ein lahem kates," because casuistry is endless. You can always come up with, theories and ideas. Everybody can respond to his friend's claims, and then the latter will respond to the former, because everybody loves arguing because we're Jews. And people aren't objective about this. They're going to incline what you think is right, and that's going to shape what you are. So what do you do? How do you paskin halacha? How do you do this? How do you know you're right? How do you know when you're right? If immediately, spontaneously, without any thought, without any contemplation, you come up with a response to a misleading idea, which shows us it means that this is the correct response. This is what rose in thought before us at all times. Before anybody disagreed with us. And that's how I know I'm telling the truth. As it really is. And I didn't make up false things just because I love arguing. It's similar to the halachic concept of Mesiach Lefi Tumo. The concept of Mesiach Lefi Tumo is that you have greater credibility. Like, for example, if you're afraid that milk fell into the cholent pot, you can't go and ask a non-Jew directly, did you pour milk into there? You're gonna be like, that looks really good. What's the secret ingredient? And if he says, oh, milk, meaning he's speaking naively, he's speaking in his innocence, that's Mesiach Lefi Tumo, right? So he says that correct halacha, proper poskim of halacha, is almost like Mesiach Lefi Tumo, right? It's almost like it has to be completely naive. And it's more credible that way because you're not strategizing and you're not fighting war with strategizing. Rather, there's a certain naivete that you have. Okay, what I'd like to do, we've seen now that the prevailing view is that Hatam Sofer is orthodox, that he has a rigid way of thinking, that he's strict. We also have seen that a lot of his writing demonstrates a really, really robust originality and creativity, l'kula, l'chumra, in the world of ideas and in the world of practice. I'm constantly astounded by his brilliance, his creativity, his humor. And so I would like, so I don't think that the regnant paradigm, I don't think that it really accounts for everything. My teacher, Maoz Kahana, he suggested another lens to look at him, which it encompasses a lot of these elements that are part of the prevailing paradigm, but it adds to them. And that is, and with this we'll conclude. He sees the Hatam Sofer as a romantic. Now, the romantic movement, romanticism, was a movement that arose at this period in history, the earlier part, the first half of the 19th century, as a response to the Enlightenment, and as a form of what's called counter-enlightenment, right? That if the Enlightenment was all about the universal and the rational, this is all about the subjective, the particular, individual charisma, sources of knowledge that you can't necessarily share with others, right? It meant glorification of the past, especially the medieval past. Hatam Sofer definitely checks that box. It meant glorification of folk ways and customs and lore and literature and even art and music, the neo-Gothic, right? The taking of folk music and embedding them into classical themes. And you definitely see Hatam Sofer doing that, the whole idea of taking customs and taking derabbanans and elevating them to the level of deoraita. It very much resonates with this idea of the elevation and glorification of folk ways and folk customs. The counter-enlightenment was pluralistic in the sense that, at least in its non-supremacist variants, we know what happened with its supremacist variants, or these are the antecedents of its supremacist variants. But in its pluralistic variants, it's like we have folk ways, and another folk might have their folk ways, right? And that's okay. We'll be true to our folk ways. You'll be true to your folk ways, right? And Hatam Sofer, he's not anti-non-Jews. He's anti-Jews imitating non-Jews, becoming like non-Jews. Jews should be true to their folk ways, especially since those folk ways are themselves the vehicle for God's continued revelation in this world. And an emphasis on that which is beyond rational, whether it's the mystical or what comes after you master something, what comes after you've already encountered the rational. There are other sources of knowledge and there are other sources of experience that are also part and parcel of the human experience, and those shouldn't be and can't be discounted. So now that we have this other view, this other way, this other lens through which to look at the Hatam Sofer, it leaves us with a question about his legacy. I've argued that the Hatam Sofer was far less, at least intellectually, rigid than the Mendelssohns and then the Biurists, that he was much more willing to entertain a plethora of ideas that, one pasuk can sustain multiple meanings. So does that mean that he wasn't really the founder of quote unquote capital O orthodoxy? Or perhaps does it mean that orthodoxy itself isn't what we thought it was? And I will leave you with that question. Thank you. See if there are questions here. I'll stay on and answer some questions if you'd like, but we are.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. I just had one thought about the presentation, which is that it strikes me that what I understood from the lecture, maybe that was that text that was very difficult to decipher. What he seems to be saying is that our attempt to understand and the multiple chidushim point us in the direction that actually, at the end of the day, we can't actually understand it. Or there are maybe infinite possibilities, and then we're sort of forced to choose one, and the best one to choose is what's always been there. What we are commanded to do, we come to, it's like Rav Nachman, the highest knowledge is to know that you can't know. If that be the case, then there are two things. One is that at the end of the day, decision is made through what you call intuition.
Thank you. That's what he means. Right?
That strikes me as very conservative.
Once it's already non-rational, all we have is that which is written, that which is tried and true, that which is already part of the tradition. Thank you.
Rabbi Fischer.
Rabbi Nachman Mibreslov, yes, the article that I was referring to where Maoz Kahana, puts Hatam, creates this dialogue between Hatam Sofer and Spinoza. He has Rabbi Nachman Mibreslov on Team Hatam Sofer, and they were contemporaries. I don't know if they ever met. They were in different empires, but they were contemporaries.
Tim, did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Rabbi Fischer, there's been a lot of debate. Firstly, thank you very much for enlightening us on the romantic side of the
enlightenment, chas v'shalom,
of explaining possibly, because looking at his sons and his descendants, the Hatam Sofer and the so forth, extreme hardliners, not following possibly this train of thought, and I believe as well there's been substantial discussion on whether the Hatam Sofer actually gave drashot in German, and his descendants ardently deny that. So I'm just wondering whether the descendants of Rabbi Hirsch managed to carry on his term Derech Eretz, but I don't think the descendants of the Hatam Sofer managed to continue his line of thought. What is your feeling of that?
Hatam Sofer, in terms of his descendants, you can find descendants of the Hatam Sofer of every single stripe. I was in Vienna a couple of years ago, back when we could travel, and my wife and I, we stopped in this, an antique bookstore, and we saw a book that had belonged to Hatam Sofer's great grandson, whose name was also Avraham Shmuel Binyamin, which was the same name as his son, the Ketav Sofer. And I mentioned it to our host there, and he says, "Oh yeah, I should tell any of the 50 Avraham Shmuel Binyamins who are his descendants who live here." Right? So it's like he's like the Genghis Khan of the.
He married several times.
Everybody's his descendant.
Yeah, he married several times, and I believe.
What was that?
I believe he married several times.
Yes, he married 3 times. I think he only had children with his first 2 wives. His second wife was the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eger, who was his contemporary. And his first wife died relatively young. His second wife died also relatively young. She was much younger than he was. And he married 3 times.
Just to set the record straight, all of his children came from the second wife.
All of them?
Yes.
Really?
Oh, okay. Well,
Thank you.
speaking of descendants of the Hatam Sofer, David Glasner is the Dor Revi'i from the Dor Revi'i, the Dor Shli. Yeah.
That's right. You can, right.
Right? You're the great-grandson of the
grandson of the great-grandson.
Of the Hatam Sofer, a great-grandson of Rabbi Moshe Shmuel Glasner, who was the rabbi in Cluj, Koloshvar, Klausenberg in today Romania, who was himself, wrote the book Dor Revi'i, and who was, and this is something that many descendants of the Hatam Sofer will vehemently deny, and even descendants of Rabbi Glasner himself will vehemently deny that he was a Zionist, but he was a Zionist, Rabbi Glasner. And his book, Dor Revi'i, was a play on the fact that on one hand, he was the 4th generation from the Hatam Sofer, and on the other hand, Dor Revi'i Yashuvu Hena, the 4th generation will return to Eretz Yisrael, that the title of the book is a reflection of his Zionism. Yeah.
Can I change my mind and ask one small question?
Sure.
The Rabbi Nathan Adler, which you mentioned, is this the one who was suspected in being involved in magic?
Oh, yeah.
So here is the question.
I think it went well beyond suspicion.
Yeah, so the fact that his 2 teachers like Ashala Kadosh and Nathan Adler with magic, and the fact that there was stories about Hatam Sofer himself exercising a D-book, and you mentioned that he wrote amulets. So
Yeah.
all this is
that he,
Psika. I mean, it's different.
I think that's part of his, when we talked about the landscape of the early Ashkenazic landscape, I think that's part of it. One of the tshuvot that I didn't get to was about Nittelnacht, right? Now, Nittelnacht, today it's pretty much only Hasidim that observe it, but the origins of the customs of not learning Torah on Christmas Eve is actually in the Rhineland, right? The earliest attestations that we have of it are in communities of the Rhineland, Karlsruhe and Frankfurt and Worms, and all in the in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the Hatam Sofer even writes that his Rebbe and his father both gave the same explanation for why we don't learn Torah on Christmas Eve. And then he says, I don't like those explanations, and he gives his own explanation, but he still doesn't learn Torah on Christmas Eve. And you contrast that with Rav Elazar Fleckelis, who was in Prague and a student of the Noda Yehuda and a contemporary of Hatam Sofer, where he writes in a tshuva that was discovered by Mark Shapiro in an archive in Prague. He writes how, there's nothing in Shas and Poskim that says that you're not allowed to learn on Christmas Eve, so I learn on Christmas Eve. And for the Hatam Sofer, that's not really, the fact that it doesn't say that in Shas and Poskim doesn't really matter as much to him, because if my father didn't learn on Christmas Eve and my Rebbe, Reb Nosson Adler, didn't learn on Christmas Eve, I'm not going to learn on Christmas Eve. Now, if you get back, earlier into where this comes from, it's there were all kinds in the weeks leading up to Christmas, there were all kinds of legends in the German countryside about various demons that would be wandering around, and that you had to be careful and you couldn't go out at night because there are demons that are running around, and you can Google pictures of these demons. Like they're pretty scary. They would kidnap kids, they would eat kids, like frightening stuff, like the stuff that's like straight out of like the Brothers Grimm. And that's very much part of that romanticism, right? And I think that's he lived in a world that was still enchanted with demons and with segulot, and with Moshe Kahana has an article about his exorcisms, but magic was still a part of his worldview.
Thank you.
you very much, Rabbi Fischer.
Also, Rabbi Akiva Eger, people have been talking about him because he was the one who got the medal from the Kaiser because of his handling of the, his leadership of the Jewish community during the cholera epidemic in 1831. And he would, this is Hatam Sofer's father-in-law. Hatam Sofer, we're not going to talk about his relationship with the cholera epidemic because he, put it this way, he was not nearly as outstanding as his father-in-law in this regard. But Rabbi Akiva Eger, he was the one who was like, yeah, he was the one who said, we have to post cops outside the synagogues to make sure that not too many people show up, right? To keep the numbers down in the shuls. Like he was really on top of this. And he cut out all kinds of things like we got to finish davening really quickly so that the next shift can come in and daven. And he got a citation of merit from the Kaiser, but he also wrote Segulot. He also was writing these, magical amulets to ward off plague, just at the same time that he was telling people to go visit the doctor. So, the idea that a magical worldview is completely incompatible with an empirical worldview or with a rationalist worldview, historically, that's just not the case. People, were able of holding all kinds of contradictory thoughts even before breakfast.
Thank you, Rabbi Fischer. I think we'll have to stop at this point.
Thank you, Rabbi Fischer, for this very interesting class. Thank you also to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We continue our spring program this evening at 8 p.m. with the third session of a class on King Solomon and his demons with Rabbi David Zilber. We also meet again tomorrow at 1 p.m. with the third session of a class on rabbinic authority and personal autonomy in early rabbinic law with Dr. Ayelet Hoffman-Lipset. In addition, we always have many more classes happening. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. You can also watch classes live. We also have recordings of all classes live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn with you, Rabbi Fischer. And thank you again.
I'm going to go play in the snow now.
Wonderful. And thanks again, everyone who attended. We really hope to see you tonight, tomorrow, or soon at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha. Thank you so much.